Well, given that, and given everything that we just had a chance to hear from Adrian with respect to how we lean into the practice of imagination and also how it connects to funding in particular, we're really excited to work with all of you to start to explore what it means to reimagine how we fund. So, Jess and Joanna spoke earlier about how the seven practices undo the consolidation of imaginative leadership that is so pervasive in this loveless economy. And for those of us on the Beloved Economies team in our conversations with co-learners over the years, co-learners often reflected on how one of the most sort of potent realms to unlock in terms of breaking the stranglehold on imagination is when we go straight to the source of capital. So the realm of funding, whether it's investment capital for businesses or grants for nonprofits, business as usual tells us that those with the capital or with roles proximate to the capital set the agenda, the terms, and call the shots. And so in essence, what happens is we give those with proximity to capital more power and give their words more weight. And this is what Marjorie Kelly of the Democracy Collaborative calls capital bias. So, with funding playing a powerful role in shaping how our whole economy works, it shapes our incentives, it shapes our timelines, our values, our norms. Eric spoke to that a bit earlier, and Adrian was just referencing that as well. Because of that uniquely powerful role, we wanted to ensure that this intensive includes a session that's devoted solely to reimagining and repairing how we fund. So that's what we're doing in this final amount of time together here today. And for me in my work with Beloved Economies and in my work more broadly advocating and building alternatives in funding, I've become really deeply compelled by the power of reimagining funding. So bringing our two themes together today and to think about what it looks like when early stage investment invites in entrepreneurs as co-stewards and designers of how that capital flows, like co-learners Nina Soul Robinson and Jessica Norwood of Runway do every day, and which Jessica beautifully writes about in her newly released book, Believe in You Money, which we heard a little bit about in our very first intensive session. Or whether that's grant funding that decouples those who are holding the wealth from those making the decisions, and that's taking place in a growing array of forums, which we'll hear about as well. So there's some really exciting and life-giving shifts happening and how we fund. And we're going to hear now from an awesome panel of three people in our Beloved Economies community who are doing some truly imaginative work around that and pushing the envelope for what funding can be and do. So we're really deeply grateful to have the opportunity to hear from three visionaries in reimagining funding, each of whom helps lead an organization that's really at the forefront of this field. We're very honored at Beloved Economies to be collaborating with all of these folks as part of this overarching transition that we mentioned earlier, going from a time-bound campaign to a movement ecosystem. So I'll introduce our three speakers and then they'll join us on the screen as well. So Dana Kaoka Chen is the co-executive director of Justice Funders, where she leads Justice Funders in partnering with and guiding philanthropy in reimagining practices that advance a thriving and just world. Dana leads with vision and is guided by relationships. As founding executive director of Justice Funders, Dana grew the organization by aligning its strategy to the visions of movements working for racial, economic, and social justice. For her work advocating for deeper investments in social movements and grassroots organizing, Dana was recognized by the Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and Philanthropy as one of 25 national leaders in action. Dana's leadership in facilitating a just transition for philanthropy by redistributing wealth, democratizing power, and shifting economic control to communities has resulted in millions of philanthropic dollars being mobilized and aligned to build infrastructure for frontline communities to govern themselves today. So, Dana, thank you for being with us today. We're also going to be joined by Nina Soul Robinson, who is fund director of the financial innovation firm Runway. Nina is a financial activist, capital convener, and creative. She's passionate about building the conditions for an economy rooted in justice and joy by embracing transformative practices that build community wealth creation and promote healing for Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities and Mother Earth. Nina's journey to this work started in technology and evolved into social entrepreneurship, community finance, and impact investing. As a portfolio member, she has served as a board member, a portfolio manager. She has served as a board member and advised numerous small businesses on growth strategy and raising integrated capital, including philanthropic and non-extractive equity investments via private placement, crowdfunding, and Title III crowd investing platforms. Nina is also a member of the co-learning community for Beloved Economies Research and is featured in the book. And many of you may also know her for the musical magic she creates as DJ Nina Soul. So Nina, excited to hear from you today as well. And then Ariane Schaefer is Director of Programs at Kindle Project, a women-founded, women of color-led, grassroots philanthropic organization working intersectionally to build bridges, flip power, and support community-driven philanthropy. Ariane began her work with Kindle Project in 2010 as the communications director. During that time, she co-founded the Indie Philanthropy Initiative, which is a creative disruption to the status quo of funding. From 2019 to 2021, she served as the co-executive director of Edge Funders Alliance, a network of 320 donors, foundation officers, trustees, and advisors in more than 30 countries committed to advancing equity and justice. She has since returned to the Kindle Project, where she's the director of programs, where most of her days are spent facilitating participatory grant-making cohorts that activate power sharing in the sector. Ariane is also a sought-after performative storyteller, an up-and-coming podcast host, and as we witnessed at a recent Beloved Economies strategy retreat that everyone here on the panel was a part of, she's a true gift for bringing humor to the weird world of funding in ways that help us all re-examine the way things are and see new possibilities. So thank you for being with us as well. So I'll invite all three of our speakers onto our stage here. Perfect. Amazing. Welcome, welcome. So thank you all for joining us. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge just how incredibly badass all of your backgrounds and biographies and accomplishments are. And with that, I'll just start with a first question for the two of you. In your own journey, what was it that first made you question how funding works in this leveless economy? And how did you find the courage and the clarity to take your initial steps in reimagining and repairing how we fund? So whoever wants to start, please feel free.
Ari, you want to go?
You want me to go? Okay, I can go. Hi, Nina. Hi, Dana. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Thanks for having me here. What a cool question. So I love this leap. I mean, for me, this journey started in Montreal. I was in my 20s. It was wonderful. I was working at a really incredible women's organization, and we had to write grants for our jobs, like for our salaries. Anybody else ever had to do that? Maybe some of us are still doing that. We kind of are still doing that, but in a different way. I was just like, I don't understand the system. It doesn't seem like a good idea. Like we were doing such incredible work with young women from around the city that really needed it. It was effective, and I was just so baffled. Being this young person in this nonprofit sector, I was really confused by it. So I was fatigued. So I think fatigue was part of the first step in my journey. Even though I was still really young, I was still fatigued. And then right around that time, Kindle Project started. That was about 15 years ago, maybe a little bit more. And so I've had the opportunity to work with Kindle Project, where I work now, in some form or another for 15 years. And so right away, I was like, wait, philanthropy is so cool. This is so amazing. This is so interesting. And then I learned quite quickly, oh, maybe not all of philanthropy is so cool and amazing. Kindle Project is, and some other folks are, and we're building it. So I feel like that's a very condensed version of my journey of seeing at Kindle, like imagination was the center in a lot of ways of what we were building. Philanthropy was the mechanism, but imagination and creativity and generosity and deep relationships and like shining beautiful light on things that needed light shown on them from the sector that didn't look in those directions, like that was the basis of what we were doing. So the imagination was always there, and then quite quickly I saw that imaginative spark was also needed in other major parts of the philanthropic system. Yeah, I think that's the little mini journey. But Nina or Dana?
Go for it. Go ahead, Nina.
Yeah, so wonderful to be here with everyone. So good to see y'all. Yeah, I think same trauma, exhaustion, overwhelm. At Runway, a group of us came together, Friends and Family Capital for Black entrepreneurs, and most of us were consultants, or we sort of had multiple hustles, and we were doing this just really, from a place of passion and a connection to Jessica Norwood's vision. But we were starting to get to a place where we're like, we need to, raise some money and hire some people. And we're so tired. None of us want to do this in the way that we have done in as executive directors, as leaders of other nonprofits. And we all started venting, and that turned into what we now call our funder manifesto. And it lives on our website. And basically it talks about what it means to be in right relationship with a Black-led organization, for people that are not, distinct from the racial wealth gap. We also are living some of the same challenges. And so, in the same way that we ask entrepreneurs to do their work and show up in a certain way to be ready to receive capital, we want to ask our funders to also do that work and really be in partnership with one another. And I think that was a really empowering step that, has set the tone for some beautiful relationships that we have. How about you, Dana?
Thanks, Nina. It's always so inspiring to hear the runway story. For me, specifically, it was about 12 years ago, and I was a candidate for a leadership role at another self-described social justice philanthropy network. And I was offered the position, and at which point I disclosed that I was pregnant with my second child, and the offer was rescinded. And I make a point to share that story in terms of, like, when we talk about like a loveless economy, right? That was probably one of the lowest points of my career because I felt absolutely powerless. And I think the lingering impact was the combination of shame and self-doubt that I internalized. But because I needed to work, right? I needed to support this growing family. I applied to lead what was then the Bay Area Justice Funders Network, which was the precursor to Justice Funders. And as it was a new organization, I really had to push myself to imagine, like, what was the antithesis of what I just experienced? Like, how do we create an organizational model that has an active practice for the values that we say we believe in? How do you really actually get into right relationship with where this wealth has come from and where it needs to go? How do we build a base of committed folks in philanthropy who understand and are aligned around the same vision and values that our movements are calling for in terms of building a regenerative, a solidarity, a beloved economy? How do we get to there? So I think, Sonia, your original question was like, okay, how do we find the courage? And I can only say at that moment, I don't know that it was courage for me. I think it was like the antidote, right, in some ways to the despair was the hope, that need for that protopian future that Jess and Asha talked about. It was more like, I felt like I had that moral imperative to figure out, like, how do we build spaces where we can thrive, right? Like, how do I use this perch that I've been given to really actually figure out, how do I leave a better world for the kids that I'm trying to actually, like, literally birth into this world? And so I think that was the initial spark for how do we turn it around? How do we move into that vision of what else can be different, what else can change?
Thank you for that. And thank all three of you for sharing such candid and deeply personal experiences, because I think that there's such connection between that and how we are in workplaces and as people who work. And all of you also shared this thread around experiencing some of that trauma, exhaustion in relationship to spaces of philanthropy, in relationship to funding and how funding works. So I'm curious, for the three of you in your work that you do today, what types of funding and funding institutions do you focus on or interact with? Where is this funding coming from? Who is it flowing to? And then how do you think about who's actually making decisions about that? So I'll hand it to whomever wants to start.
Nina, you start this time. Go on.
All right, I'm not gonna argue with Ari, never. So I started reflecting. I was like, well, it comes from people that we've been in deep relationship with, over our careers and periods of time. But I think a common denominator is that these are people that are committed to restorative finance, investment, in the work that, I'm focused on. I'm usually raising capital that's being returned. And usually there's a ton of interest for people that want to give loans, and they're usually beating down our door to do that. But when we say, in addition to those investments, we want to do repair work. We want to deal with folks' money trauma. We want to provide this wraparound holistic business support. We want to do power building in our community. We want to create ways for entrepreneurs to be engaged in local level change and beyond. And all of that requires different kind of resources, unrestricted funding and long-term funding. And so I feel like it's folks that are committed to that long-termism, like that is a core belief. They are unrestricted in their funding. They're giving long-term. A lot of them are committed to spending down or contemplating a spend down, which, has been interesting for a whole lot of other reasons that we talked about a little bit at our gathering. But yeah, I would say that's some of the core tenets.
Thank you for that. Ari or Dana?
Sonia, what your question made me think about is actually to reference some of the things that I think earlier speakers talked about in terms of like, where does this wealth that we call philanthropy come from, right? It's made off of the extraction of natural resources. It's built off of stolen land and labor. And then it's held in a tax shelter, right? So it's inaccessible to the commons. So for me, like funding connotes a power dynamic. It's created by those who have wealth and the power to decide how that wealth is used, as Adrienne Marie Brown talked about earlier. So who can access it, who can decide what it's used for. And so at our organization, Justice Funders, a lot of the things we think about, right, is like, so how do we support philanthropy to take this extracted wealth and return it to frontline movements who are building our regenerative economy? And how we do so is really about thinking about, well, how can we change who owns and who decides how capital is governed and stewarded? So a lot of the things that we're wrestling with right now, right, is both what are the actual tangible structures that are needed? So what is the infrastructure that we need to rethink, recreate? What are the processes and structures and cultures that we also need to attend to, right? How is that reflected in the investment policy statements that philanthropies use around how those endowments or their investments are used? Are they actually given guidance to the financial advisors that they use in order to determine whether or not they have, for instance, a policy around non-accumulation? Or to Nina's point, non-extractive finance in the way that they give loans to the groups that they support. So I think a lot of these things have roots, as Adrienne talked about, in a system that was not built for a beloved community, let alone a regenerative or solidarity community. So what is it that we need to actually build that would help facilitate us getting there? And I think it's looking at our systems, our cultures, our processes, and starting to attend so that we can change who owns and who decides. Ari?
Speaking of, that was all like very well segued for Kindle Project's funding universe. Thanks, friends. So at Kindle Project, we're an intermediary. So we're a foundation, but we think of ourselves as a bridge between donors and communities. And so most of our programming is participatory grant making and power sharing. So that means that most of the decisions that get made over the resources are not made by Kindle Project staff, but they're made by community members. It's super fun. It's really time consuming and really worth it. And I recommend. But it's really, really deep work. So how the money moves, like this question of who makes the decision, it is not the donors. We work with an incredible group of donors, some of whom are activists, farmers, seed savers, artists, and all people, and also some institutions as well, like some family foundations and institutional foundations, and individual donors who are excited about imagination, have creativity and longing in themselves to be part of moving the system in this way, right? And so they collaborate with Kindle. Sometimes we create programs with them from the ground up. Sometimes we start programs and donors join in. But then for the most part, it's the communities that are making those decisions. And so we use cohort models uh, for actually every participatory program that we do, meaning that we bring together groups of different community members depending on which program, and we facilitate those spaces. That's like my main job at Kindle, which is a really fun job, I must say. And the reason why we do that in community and we take that time is because we also don't want to then replicate a lot of the experiences that donors have, which can have a lot of pressure and be very isolating. And suddenly, because you have money, you're supposed to be the expert on everything you're interested in or care about. Like, so the cohort model helps in that peer support way, right? And you mentioned it, Nina, a little bit about this trauma of money. There's actually a great course out of Canada that you can take online called Trauma of Money that's really helpful and beautiful. And we use some of those practices in our work as well. But it really is about supporting community members that are now becoming donors. We call them flow funders in most of our programs to make those decisions. And what happens in those spaces is really transformative. It's like you see how this philanthropic system, this economic system that tries to remove love, care, transformation, regeneration from the experience, and it gets infused back in a way that I think personally is not that complicated. The community should make decisions over the resources they need. Like that ethos doesn't feel complex to me, but I understand there's like a lot of history and very entwined legacies that make it so that we don't think it can be that simple, right? The mechanism is there for us, like, and it just needs like some time and care and nurturing in order for those decisions then to not feel heavy and burdensome also for community members, right? So there's lots of like ways that we do that. But I think that answers the question. I hope. Yeah.
Perfectly, and sets us up for the next question, which is, speaking of those mechanisms, what are some of the concrete examples of how your organizations have successfully transformed the various ways in which funding is currently extractive or harmful? And, what have you seen in the partners that you worked with and in the spaces that you're in as well? So, Nina, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that we have a funder manifesto that we invite folks to read and sort of reflect on before we enter into relationship. And I think another thing that, feels a little bit more of a tactical thing is, really rewriting agreements and legal documents that are created, that were creating by this extractive system that was designed very much in this like very competitive and very retaliative way. And so, we're thinking about it in the documents that we have with our funders. And we're also thinking about it in the documents that we have with our businesses as well. But there was one area that was, really interesting. That it brought a lot of questions and a lot of back and forth with a lot of our funders, and it was around our reporting expectations. And there's a lot of funders that expect to get these quarterly reports, right? And that's something that, like Eric was talking about earlier with this dominant short-termism, like, how are we doing this quarter? And it creates, it just creates all the energy that so many of us have experienced when you're like under this pressure to like report, and, maybe you're going to make different decisions if your report's going to look a little different based on, the way that your borrowers are responding. And so we just want to get rid of that. We want to focus on long-termism. We're meeting with our folks on a weekly basis. We're in tune with them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to, provide these bureaucratic reports that what are they actually serving. Let's actually have a conversation instead. Or we shifted to doing like these annual webinars, for example, that are really rooted in learning and what are we experiencing. And so I think that's I think it's just like really looking at every sort of step of the way, that every single document, every single touch point, and reimagining how it can actually serve the way that we work, the way that we want to do our work.
Thank you for that.
Thanks,
Dana?
Nina. At Justice Funders, well, one, I just want to say, like, to the point Eric made earlier, right? Organizations are like living organisms, right? And so like both, how do we tend to the DNA that we give to them? And so structurally, I want to say that even though we are not a grant making institution, right, it was important for us to be guided by movements who are working for a just transition, specifically a just transition from an extractive economy to one that is regenerative and a solidarity or a beloved economy. So at a strategy level, that really means that we can't have a theory of change that works around being like a singular, exemplary anything, right? We actually have to work in an ecosystem of organizations where we are all clear that the systems that need changing are all bigger than we are. So we have one small role in that. And so at a strategy level, we recognize that. And so that means, right, like not only do we work in great collaboration and partnership with both movement and other philanthropies, but that also means, right, that like our wins are not just our wins, right? The wins that we have are the wins of our movements. And so to that end, right, like, OD folks will often talk about how form follows function. So I saw earlier in response to some of the questions that Jess and Asha made us reflect on, how do we govern? And like, are there other ways of actually choosing how to govern, right? So like for us, when we had the opportunity to then think about what kind of independent organization we wanted to be, we chose worker self-direction. So that includes shared executive leadership. That includes actually governing by 5 circles made of cross-functional teams. We are learning how to actually practice democracy in the deepest ways, and the ways in which we all are struggling because for so long we've, kind of been familiarized with this command and control and compliance model, which is so ripe within the, nonprofit industrial culture. And then programmatically, right, we're trying to manifest how to change who owns and who decides. So how do we actually facilitate that? One of the current projects we have is supporting a $20 million Just Transition Integrated Capital Fund that is actually owned by 5 democratically governed loan funds from across the country, and whose investors must report on how their participation in this fund is actually impacting the other investment work that they do. So like Nina talked about, we really have to change the culture around who's reporting what to whom and what are the purposes of the kind of reporting that we do. Yeah, I think there are other things, but I'll point to Ari now and ask you to share.
Yeah, this is so interesting. Dana, you just made me think about some conversations we've been having at Kindle Project about how, in our work, at least as an intermediary, we see ourselves really as also part of movement work, right? And that's sort of a funny thing because we're also funders and we also have access to donors and those relationships, but that's who we are as individuals, and that's also who we are as an organization. And I think that matters in terms of positionality and how we're working to change the sector and how we're viewing organizations like ours and like bridge builders that are doing this kind of work. Like it's a slow and nuanced but important shift, I think, in how some of the players are working to change and how some of the narratives of these players are being shared or not shared enough. within the sector of like progressive philanthropy, you know? And so I feel curious about that. But in terms of these sort of concrete examples, I shared some of that of Kindles and what we're working on with the cohort models. But I think I want to just take a moment to talk about time for a second. That I think about that a lot when I was reading the book, and even in what Adrienne was sharing earlier too, and Eric as well, actually. But that we get pushback sometimes for participatory grant making, that it takes a lot of time. And so there's this pull between like the urgency of what's happening, which is real, but also the like who makes decisions and how requires time, investment of relationships, of uncomfortable conversations, of making space for trust to grow between donors, intermediaries, communities. And so from my experience doing this work with Kindle for, I don't know, 15 years now, we've seen that the time is worth the investment, because then how the money moves also is transforming something. Like that's the opportunity that comes when you give enough space for those relationships to develop, and then capital flows, like the money will move. Like we don't believe on sitting on money either, right? Like the money has to keep moving to communities. But I think this kind of playing with the mechanism of time within these methodologies of moving money in a different way, I think can be really useful. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for that. I'm going to pull in some audience questions and then come back to our last question here just to close out. But a question that we have here that I think is super interesting is when we think about that issue of time, Ari, and the concept of generative relationship-based relationships with funders, how do you balance that logistically in terms of an organizational budget? How does your budgeting take into account the time, the effort that goes into those relationships that are generative? Whoever has a thought on it.
I think, Nina, you mentioned something about this, about, well, it sounds also like your funder manifesto, like the transparency of it, right? Of like, this is what it takes to do this work. And Adrienne spoke about it earlier. What does it mean to be in organizations, Dana, what you're talking about, to have our organizations also try and break outside of the nonprofit model that Eric was talking about, where we're all like exhausted and underpaid? We're not trying to replicate that either in this movement of progressive philanthropy, or I'm not. I don't think we are. I don't speak on your behalf, but so I think that there's something there about transparency. And to me, that's also relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So what does it mean to have conversations with your donors of like, this is how much this work costs? Like, this is what deep facilitation over a year looks like. This is why it costs this much. And I think having those conversations is really important, because there's all kinds of line items in a budget that if you haven't worked at a nonprofit, you might not know about, right? Like payroll and, you know, healthcare. Yeah.
Totally.
And also, like, what is our metric of success? Like, is the metric that we're just going to keep getting bigger and bigger every single year, in the same way that, you know, this whole entire system is built on, you know, growth at any at, you know, any cost. And I've been thinking a lot about that in terms of like, how are we building sustainable businesses? How are we building businesses that aren't, with entrepreneurs that aren't exhausted, that, you know, have time to dream and play and experience pleasure and spend time with their families? And what is that growth model and business sustainability look like? And then what is the funding that facilitates that? And, you know, and also in our organization too, I feel like we made a decision a few years ago where we're like, we're going to stay, you know, everyone wants to talk about scale. It's like, we're going to go deeper. We're not going to go bigger, you know, and just for growth's sake. And made a decision around the size of organization that we wanted to be. And then, you know, of course, the trade-offs around that.
Yeah, when I hear that question, I actually think one of the pivotal, when we talk about logistics, like one of the pivotal, I think, moments for justice funders has been in thinking about what the core business model is, and whether or not our core business model related to power in the same way that reinforced all of the extractive ways in which one can engage with philanthropy. So when we were the Bay Area Justice Funders Network, our model was very similar to other like organizations where we were a membership organization. So we were driven by our membership. That means you center your membership in your political decisions about what your content is, but that also means your membership is centered in terms of your financial decisions. So you can only be as radical as your least radical member. And most of your work is then oriented around keeping those with the biggest pocketbooks happy, right? So like, what does it look like to actually think about your business model in relationship to power, and then how that power base is reflected in the work that you do and how you resource yourselves? And I would say, like, for us, I think that was our biggest like logistical reckoning with, like, okay, what does it mean to actually get into a place where we would be set up to possibly move towards a more sustainable and non-extractive relationship with those that we work with.
Thank you all for that. Just with our last little bit of time here for this audience, curious if you could give folks one piece of advice, whether they're a funder themselves that's trying to shift practice with colleagues or family members, or maybe a startup entrepreneur or a grassroots activist. What would you like to share in terms of how we can all leverage the power that we have to shift how funding happens? Small question. Ari, do you want to go first?
Okay. I think get curious, like just curiosity, I think, is one of the most important practices. And I think it was embedded in each of the 7 practices in your book. I think it's the key to what makes us have the capacity to imagine beyond what we can imagine in our own selves. And also find your people. Like, this can also be fun and joyful and interesting and weird. It already is weird. And so how to make it like fun for you, that does not mean it doesn't have rigor. Also, like, the work of imagining something new, even in a joyful way, can also be rigorous. So I really feel like certainty is kind of the enemy of connection and imagination. So, like, get curious.
Dana, do you want to share?
Sure. Well, I would say personally, right? Any confrontation with the status quo is going to be challenging, right? So how do we resource ourselves to strengthen our resolve in those moments? I think for me, I'm often grounded by thinking about, like, so what kind of ancestor do I want to be to future generations? What is the world that I am leaving behind for my children, my great grandchildren? I think in those moments when we're confronting the system, we have to have the resolve that gives us the strength to continue to do the hard things, the things that may hurt us, the things that may scare us, the things that we may not be rewarded by. And so I think that the challenge for any of us in trying to disrupt any status quo is that we have to be committed to doing those hard things. And then I would echo what Ari said about, like, so challenging the status quo is also not a solitary endeavor, right? It takes collective action. So find a political home, find your community. For those of you in philanthropy, if Justice Funders can be it, like, join us, become a member. I would say, like, for those who are also like exploring practice, like, find other folks to travel with. Like, I think it really does take us learning how to be interdependent and actually practicing that, actively, to, generate something different. Nina.
So beautifully said. And that was exactly what I was thinking about, Dana, is like, this is a practice. This is a muscle that needs to be conditioned. And we are building systems that, what was the number, 2065, or, folks in the far future are going to look back and be like, we created the conditions for this beloved economy, for this alternative way of thinking. And so even though it might feel small to get started on one thing, have a book club, read the Beloved Economies book, read, believe in you money, like, so many beautiful texts are coming out right now that are giving us these playbooks and these questions and these opportunities to dream and really expand our imagination. How do we, create those learning groups and just like practice, like what is something that we can do this year, this season that we're in, and just think about it as experimentation, because we need so many solutions. Like, it's not going to look any one particular way, just like Adrienne was saying earlier. Like, we need localized versions of what moving money looks like, and examples in all these different ways. And just always center the joy. Like, it's got to feel good. It's got to be fun. There's got to be music and dancing, and it's got to look fly. We joked a lot about that in our last convening. And so, we got to make the others want to be like, what are they doing over there? That looks really fun and cute. And so, all of that.
Totally. The irresistible. Well, thank you deeply to all three of you. I think what is really important for us to remember as we're imagining is that there are things in the present that are happening that are amazing and that folks can learn from and bring into their own spaces. So I just want to say thank you so much to the three of you for providing that light and enabling other people to really see what can be possible in the now. So thank you for that. So with that, we're going to take all of this incredible knowledge and wisdom that's just been passed on and ask those of you that are with us to just do a little bit of silent reflection. That's a kind of a consolidation of some of the other reflections that we've been doing throughout the day. And in particular, we wanted you to just take a few minutes to think about particularly what is a way that you would like to reimagine and repair how funding relates to your work. And in particular, when you think about the boldly beloved work that you envision for your future, what would need to be different about your funding, whether it's funding you receive or funding you provide, in order for you to realize that vision? And then what's a first step that you can take towards this change? All right. Thank you to all of you for submitting your answers. I see things about seeding and sharing power, continuing to pursue different types of funding sources, incorporating imagination, storytelling, thinking about the ways in which funding is distributed. So thank you all for contributing your ideas to this mix. And we're looking forward to continuing to reference these and pull on these as we go forward as well. So just with our remaining few minutes here, we wanted to share an exciting announcement. As we mentioned towards the beginning of our time together today, the speculative fiction podcast, The Light Ahead, is living on beyond the close of our Beloved Economies campaign. And thanks to the Futuring Collective, which is carrying it forward as part of their work, the next season is actually already in the works. And the production partner that's making season 2 happen with Futuring Collective is Justice Funders, which you just heard a little bit about. So I'd love to pass to Justice Funders team member and amazing DJ for our session today, Dino Fox, to share more about why this season has everything to do with our focus today. So I'll pass it over to you, Dino.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Now that you've spent your day flexing your visioning muscles and dreaming with some of our best teachers in the movement, I invite you one last time to picture a new world where governance has been reimagined with decision-making power in the hands of our local communities. The economic landscape is an archipelago of regenerative local economies. Neoliberal corporate frameworks of the late millennium have faded in favor of options geared towards collective stewardship and community wealth retention, like cooperatives. Our built environment, a symbiotic blend of technology and nature, takes cues from the stewardship of First Peoples and also ensures everyone not only has a home, but a beautiful one. At the heart of it all is a cultural revolution oriented towards interdependence, mutual respect, and a celebration of diversity. We are now in the year 2118, and the recent decades have brought social metamorphosis grounded in empathy, respect, and shared prosperity. Local communities have become skilled in self-governance, and individuals have done self-work to prepare to become good ancestors and stewards of the places we call home. The boardroom has been replaced with community meetings that can often feel like the vibrant block party, with food and play and echoing with laughter, music, and shared stories. Money isn't the only dominant currency anymore. The lines between the built environment and nature have blurred. The days of mindless scrolling on our screens are over. In their place, genuine connections with other people and the natural world are prioritized. We spend more time with our relations in real life and not on screens. Memes are still around and very funny though. Gone are the days of treating ailments in isolation. The focus now, holistic well-being. It's a system that doesn't just heal, it nurtures, ensuring every individual doesn't just survive, but thrives. This is the world that Justice Funders, alongside a team of extremely talented Hollywood writers, are bringing to life as the co-producers of this season 2 of the Light Ahead podcast. Season 2 of the Light Ahead is called The Future Beyond Funding. What will it look like when we redistribute wealth, democratize power, and shift economic control to community? We hope these episodes can be supportive in your journeys of reimagining funding. When season 2 is released, we'll send out an announcement with links to the episodes to everyone who's registered for this intensive. Lastly, we're still looking for sponsors for season 2 to stand with us in bringing to life these bold visions for our future. If you and or your organization might be interested in sponsoring, please reach out to me, Dino at justicefunders.org. And you can also click on our beautiful concept note, which has been dropped into the chat. And thank you so, so much to the Futuring Collective for holding us so beautifully. And we cannot wait to share with you season 2 of the Light Ahead podcast, available on all platforms where podcasts are found.
Thank you so much to everyone for another fantastic session of learning and practicing together. Once again, stand by for the recording of today, which will be coming your way soon, along with some links to resources and information about our speakers. And we really look forward to coming together again for our final session on December 6th. So thank you. Take care, everyone, and looking forward to more.